Hello, Nutrition 101 students. If you're seeing this video for winter 2024, this is a re-recording of the cell bio lecture because students pointed out that the audio in the previous one was cutting in and out, so hopefully this one records better. If you're seeing this for a different quarter, then welcome. In this lecture, we're going to talk about some of the basic cellular biology content, ideas, knowledge and skills that you will need in order to understand the rest of the content that we discuss in this course. Since this is teaching about nutrition from a biology lens, trying to understand how each of the molecules within our food are utilized and affect our body, having at least somewhat of a basis in biology is going to be really important moving forward. And so again, this is going to focus on cellular biology that we will use throughout the rest of this course. So this content is very important. So first off, there is something within biology called cell theory. Any hypothesis that has evolved to take on the title of a theory or law within science is an idea that has been strongly supported over and over again through lots of research in order to reach this title. So a theory in science is not the same thing as a theory that we use in colloquial speech. Right? When you just say that you have a theory about something, it's generally just an idea. In science, a theory is very strongly supported and is generally accepted as the answer to whatever question it's addressing. So in this case, cell theory is describing the idea that all living organisms are composed of one or more cells. So everything that we have been able to observe that is capable of the general functions of a living thing, those things have been composed of at least one cell or more, right? So organisms like ourselves are very large eukaryotic organisms with trillions of cells in our body, right? And beyond that, all cells that exist today must have come from some cell before them, right? So this does not seek to answer the question of where did life start or how did life start, but from what we have observed, all cells come from some other cell that was before them. We don't know where the first cell came from necessarily, but we know that cells replicate, and in order for new living things to exist, there must have been another living thing before it to create it. And so I guess the last thing there, kind of what I addressed already, the cell is the basic unit of life. If all living things are composed of at least one cell, then a cell is required for living things. It is the most basic unit of what a living organism can be. And so in this course, we're going to be coming back to this idea a lot of you are what you eat, because this is literally true. Your cells, your body is made up of the molecules that come from your food. And so whatever you are putting into your body is what your cells have to use to make new cells and to support the functions that keep you alive. So in our human bodies, we have 10 to 100 trillion human cells. Okay, so these are the cells that all share the same DNA and came from your father's sperm fertilizing your mother's egg to create the very first cell that was you. So they combine their DNA, you get half of your chromosomes from your mother, half your chromosomes from your father, all of which code for the same genes. Those chromosomes then pair up and interact, and some genes are dominant, some genes are not dominant, they're recessive, some genes have other interactions, but the combination of those genes is what produces your characteristics. And so that first cell then divided into 2, and then to 4, and then to 8, building the trillions of cells that now make up your entire body. But beyond those 10 to 100 trillion human cells, we have 10 times that amount. So 1 quadrillion or 100 trillion bacterial cells that live within and on your body. And although that might be a scary idea to recognize that there are more bacterial cells in and on your body than there are your own human cells, this has been going on for millions of years. We have co-evolved with these bacteria, and we rely on them very heavily, and they have a strong impact on our lives beyond just simply how we digest our food, but also how we think, feel, act, etc. So these bacteria are really important, and we do get to talk about some of the interactions of our microbiome. That is the term that refers to the bacteria that live within our bodies. It's basically its own ecosystem, so it's called a microbiome. We'll only get to touch on this a little bit within this class, but if you are interested, you do have the opportunity to choose this as a research topic for your group research project, if you're doing that in the quarter that you're watching this video. The microbiome was also my area of focus when I was doing undergraduate research, when I was studying biology. So really, really cool stuff. It's come a long way in the past 2 years as far as our understanding of how these bacterial cells affect our bodies. A lot of really cool, interesting stuff there. So check it out if you're interested in learning more. And so our bodies are organized of cells, but those cells are made up of molecules, right? And this is a lot of what we'll be talking about in this class. The molecules that make our cells, we must get from our food, right? And then our bodies have the ability to transform those molecules into other molecules to meet our needs, but we must get them from our food in order to use them. And those molecules are made up of even smaller individual elements called atoms. So the tiniest unit of matter, of things that take up space in this universe, are called atoms. These are individual units of each element. Atoms bond with each other to make molecules, which are slightly larger interactions between multiple elements. Molecules can then bond together to make larger structures like organelles and cells themselves. And then cells work together to make tissues. So a tissue in biology is a group of cells that have the same general shape or function. So they become specialized to perform specific jobs, such as the epithelial cells in our intestines, which have been specialized, shaped, and take on the function responsible for increasing the amount of absorption. So increasing the likelihood that the food you have digested, food you have ingested into your mouth, brought down into your stomach and through your small intestine and large intestine, trying to ensure that those molecules from your food actually get into your body and don't just pass through that system and then are excreted as waste. So those cells have become specialized to do just that, okay? Compared to the cells of like our brain, our neurons, they have a completely different shape, they have completely different functions, and are not specialized to increase absorption. Rather, they are specialized to transmit signals. And so lastly, different groups of tissues will work together to create an organ. And that organ does one or two specific jobs for the entire body, for the entire organism, right? These organs work together within organ systems, and we have multiple organ systems in our body that all work together to support the overall health of this one individual, of your entire organism. And each of these cells could be considered a tiny microcosm of you. These cells need to do the exact same things that you as an entire organism need to do. So they need to drink, they need to eat, they need to digest or break down food and molecules, they need to harvest energy from that food, and they also need to grow and reproduce. And so the last thing here, cells also need to make food. In the case of animals like ourselves, our cells cannot make their own food, but plants can, and their cells do that as well. And so within our cells, just like how our large body has organs that are specialized, cells have organelles, which literally means tiny organs or cellular organs, which are specialized to support the health of that cell. And there's only a few organelles that we're going to focus on for the purposes of this course specifically, since we are really just looking at human nutrition. And so we're really focused on animal cells. And there's just these 4 main organelles that are present in all eukaryotic cells that you need to be aware of as far as how they function, because they'll impact what we talk about in this course. So those are going to be the nucleus, ribosomes, mitochondria, and cell membrane. And I am giving a bit of a reference here to chloroplasts, which are unique to plant cells, just to express how important plants are in order for us to survive. But so starting off with our animal cells with these structures. So the nucleus is kind of the brain of the cell. The nucleus is the home base, which is where all of our genetic information is stored. So your DNA, those genes and chromosomes I was talking about earlier that you inherited from your parents, those are all stored and protected within the nucleus. And those genes, that DNA, provides instructions for how your cell and your body will function. And so in that way, it is regulating everything that is occurring in that cell, and thus regulates cell metabolism. This term metabolism, which was introduced earlier in the course, is referring to all of the chemical reactions that are occurring within a cell. And so since the nucleus provides instructions for how your cell is going to function, it is therefore regulating all of those chemical reactions. And so how does it do this? With those instructions, right? There must be some product. Having a blueprint for something doesn't get that thing done. You can't have a blueprint for a building and just expect the building to be built because you have those instructions, right? You must build that building. You need tools to do the actual construction and to carry out those instructions. And so the ribosomes are responsible for making those tools, for reading those blueprints and creating an actionable molecule to then go carry that out. And the tools of the cell are proteins. So all of our DNA provides instructions for our ribosomes to then build proteins, and those proteins then carry out the instructions. Okay. Then moving on to our mitochondria, probably the most famous organelle that I feel like everyone has heard of coming out of primary school. The mitochondria is responsible for generating a majority of the cellular energy. So we have energy contained within most of the molecules that we're getting from our food, but not every part of the cell has the ability to access that energy. And so this specific organelle, the mitochondria, is responsible for breaking down those molecules from our food, releasing the energy that was in them, and then transferring that energy to a different molecule called ATP. And then ATP provides accessible energy to the rest of the cell. And then lastly, our cell membranes. The cell membrane might be the most complex part of the cell, and it is something that we're going to have to talk about a lot in this class, because the cell membrane is the barrier that separates what is part of the cell, what is inside the cell here, compared to what is outside of the cell. And so our whole process of digestion, or our whole process of eating, or what we're doing when we eat, is breaking down the food that we got into its smallest pieces parts that we can, trying to get them into the tiniest molecules that we can, and so that we have an easier time than taking those molecules across these cell membranes to get into our cells, and then across the cell membrane again to get into our circulatory system, and then across the cell membrane again somewhere else to get into the cell that needs it. So these membranes, again, provide a barrier between the external environment and the internal environment of the cell. And the structure and function of the cell membrane is going to be really particular and really important for our understanding of how these molecules get into and out of our cells, into and out of our bodies in general. So lastly, again, this organelle is specific to just plant cells. It is very similar to the mitochondria, and that organelle is the chloroplast. So the chloroplast is the organelle that plants have and other photosynthetic organisms have that allows them to capture energy from the sun and use it to make new food, typically a carbohydrate, or specifically it is making carbohydrates, making glucose from that solar energy. But then from that glucose, that cell can then make fats, lipids, can make proteins, can make any other molecule, any other organic molecule. And so photosynthetic organisms like plants have that special ability to literally make food from air. So take inorganic carbon dioxide, which us as animals, we cannot use as a source of energy or in order to build larger molecules. But plants have the ability to take that molecule, crush those carbons together using energy from the sun in order to make glucose, sugar, as a source of food, as a new organic molecule. So this is basically restating what I was just talking about, right? Plants, through this process of photosynthesis, are ultimately responsible for all of the food on this planet. So without photosynthetic organisms, animals would perish. We have no way to create new food. We just have the ability to consume it and transform it. And thus all carbohydrates come from plants, come from photosynthetic organisms in general. Don't need to get too far into the specifics here. This is just showing the different parts of a chloroplast. You may see this again if you take like a Bio 160 course. But the important piece of information here is that energy from the sun it allows plants to, again, take this carbon dioxide, this inorganic carbon, and combine carbons, multiple carbons together into a simple carbohydrate called glucose. So this is a sugar, right? And then that glucose can be transformed into fats or proteins or into other types of sugars, right? And as a byproduct of this reaction, the plants will produce oxygen as a waste product. So they're taking in carbon dioxide, making new glucose, and then releasing oxygen into our environment. We as animals will then breathe in that oxygen, we'll eat that glucose, we'll break the glucose apart, and then release carbon dioxide as our waste product. So we get this cycle of energy and cycle of molecules between the mitochondria and chloroplast in that way. So the mitochondria heavily relies on that oxygen. Without oxygen, the mitochondria cannot function. Okay? So we get this cycle of taking in oxygen and glucose. The mitochondria will then break that glucose apart using oxygen to draw electrons from, I'm not going to get too much into that, but using that oxygen, it breaks glucose apart. And as a result, it produces water and carbon dioxide. The chloroplasts of plants can then use that water and carbon dioxide to make new glucose and oxygen, and so it continues to cycle. Okay. So a little bit about the cell membrane here. Like I said, this is probably the most complicated, but also the most important structure in our cells for us to understand for this course. And because the cell membrane acts as that barrier. It is the outer layer of the cell, essentially like our skin, right, which is what separates our bodies from our environment, which encloses all of the cells in our body. So the cell membrane is composed of this, what is called the phospholipid bilayer. So bi meaning two, because we have two layers of these phospholipid molecules. And they're arranged in a way so that the portions of the phospholipids that interact well with water are facing outwards in both directions. So we have these hydrophilic heads of the phospholipids pointing towards the exterior and pointing towards the inside of our cells. And then we have these hydrophobic tails, which do not interact with water. They do not like water, making up the internal portion of that bilayer. We do have other molecules in here, proteins, carbohydrates, and then other lipids called cholesterol, which helps stiffen the membrane. But mainly, we're going to be talking about that phospholipid structure, what that does for the cell, a little bit about cholesterol, and then the proteins that are in there. So this is what that phospholipid bilayer structure looks like. So this is our cell membrane. An important thing to keep in mind anytime we're talking about or looking at cells is that cells are three-dimensional, right? They take up space in this universe. They are not flat like how we see it in some images. They are a three-dimensional spherical-like shape. And so this membrane is completely surrounding that three-dimensional shape. And so what we see here are these phospholipids. Like I said, we have a head here that can interact with water, and those heads are pointing towards the exterior and towards the inside of our cells. And then the inside of our membrane is full of these hydrophobic tails. So you could think of these tails as like oil, like the vegetable oil that you use to cook with, right? It's liquid fat. And then these heads are then a barrier trying to kind of hold them together and keep them separate from the water that would be outside of this cell and inside of this cell. And so because these lipids, these tails here are liquid at our body temperature at 98.6 degrees, this other type of lipid, this other fat called cholesterol, can be embedded in this membrane to make it more solid, to give it more structure and prevent all these things from moving all the time and potentially even coming apart. But then we also have proteins embedded throughout our membrane. And these proteins are really important because they provide passage for molecules that we need to get into or out of the cell. There is a very select list of molecules that are able to just cross this membrane, cross this barrier without help. And so in order for us to transport any of those other molecules that are not on that list and cannot simply diffuse across this membrane, they are going to need the help of a protein. And so we have various types of proteins that help with the transport of all different types of molecules that are important for the cell. Okay. And so I've kind of touched on this idea already, right? But so our cells have a membrane as this barrier, and we have lots of organelles inside of our cells. But besides those organelles, what do you think is filling up the rest of that space? You could take a second to pause and think about this as to what is actually filling up the rest of the space within a cell. But the answer here is essentially water. Okay? It is a water-based solution called cytoplasm or cytosol, and so mostly water. Okay? And so anytime you are given a cell and asked to do any thinking about the environment or how things are moving or whatever's going on, you should assume that the internal environment of this cell is going to be mainly water-based, and the external environment of the cell is going to mainly be water-based, because that is going to be true 99.9% of the time. And this becomes important because we're going to talk a lot about how molecules move in an environment or within a cell, based on how they interact with water. And so most molecules we can categorize as either water soluble, meaning they dissolve in and can interact with water, or lipid soluble, meaning they cannot interact with water, they cannot dissolve in water, but instead they can interact with and bond with lipids, with fats. Because lipids themselves do not interact with or bond with water, right? They are hydrophobic, which means afraid of water. And so whether a molecule is hydrophilic, meaning it does bond with water, or hydrophobic, meaning it does not, is going to greatly impact how it moves through our bodies and how it needs to be transported in and out of a cell. Okay, so that brings us to some of that nutrient transport. Right? Like I said, the cell membrane and whether or not a molecule can just cross it on its own is going to be really important for understanding how these nutrients from our food move throughout our body and get into or out of our cells. So we have a few different types of transport to be aware of as we move forward. So the first is simple diffusion. Diffusion is just the free movement of molecules through a space. And typically this is driven by the concentration of that molecule. So whenever there is a bunch of these molecules in a small amount of space, those molecules are going to want to spread out. And so they will diffuse to whatever space has less of that molecule. They want to spread out until they have even amount of space between all of them. And that is called diffusion. We can also have facilitated diffusion, meaning this molecule is still being driven by its concentration. So it's trying to move from where there is a lot of it to where there is more space instead. However, if that molecule cannot cross this barrier by itself, then it's going to need help from a protein. And so that protein helping this molecule diffuse is called facilitated diffusion. So it's still diffusion, it is just being facilitated or helped by a protein. And because it's moving with its concentration gradient, it doesn't require any extra energy to be added to it. So this is essentially a free process. It does not require energy to move that molecule with its concentration gradient. Facilitated diffusion does not require energy. And then lastly, we have active transport. So active transport is any version of moving a molecule with a protein assisting it that requires energy input. And specifically, this is going to be energy from molecules called ATP or GTP, which are both very similar. We're really just going to talk about ATP in this class. So anytime anytime a protein is going to require ATP to move a molecule, that is referred to as active transport. Active because it needs energy input. Right? So these other two examples, simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion, those are both passive transport. Right? So we have these two categories of how things move within our cells. And again, passive transport is any example that does not require energy. So that's going to be simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion. And then active transport does require energy. So it requires ATP to power that process. And so typically, any small or non-polar, polar here just meaning carrying a charge, so any small molecule that does not have a charge on it is going to have an easier time just passing through the membrane. It should just be able to diffuse, or it may need help from a protein in the form of facilitated diffusion. Right? But those small non-polar molecules should just be able to easily pass through the membrane. But then any large molecules or any molecules that are carrying a charge are going to need help in order to get through there. So they are typically going to be transported through active transport. So these next few slides are going to take a closer look at the process of diffusion and how it works. So we're going to be talking about it a lot. And then a quick look at a specific type of diffusion called osmosis, which is the diffusion of water. Okay? So for most solutions, most environments that we're going to be talking about, we are looking at a molecule or a substance that is being dissolved in water. And so that molecule that is being dissolved is called the solute. So again, this is a molecule being added. In this case, this is food coloring or food dye. It is being added to this water as a solute. And then the water itself is the solvent. So the water was already there. The water is dissolving the molecules that were added. And so the water essentially is making space for these molecules to move through. And as I mentioned earlier, these molecules are naturally molecules within space do not like being close together. If there is space for them to spread out, they will evenly spread out throughout that space. And that is essentially the core of diffusion. So diffusion is the movement of molecules from where there is a high concentration, so a lot of them together, to where there is a low concentration, so where there's more space. And this does not require energy. This is just naturally driven. They just spread out from each other. And so this is exemplified really well with food coloring, with food dye. Okay? So if you add a drop of food dye into a cup of water, you've taken this highly concentrated group of these dye molecules and have now given them a whole bunch of space that they have in order to spread out in. And so naturally, over time, just for a couple minutes, if you observe this occurring at home, you will see those molecules start to spread out throughout the space. You don't need to mix it. You don't need to add any energy. They just naturally do that. And they will spread out until they are evenly distributed throughout that space. Again, this is a passive process, does not require energy. This happens naturally. However, in the case of looking at cells and thinking about cells, oftentimes there's going to be a barrier between that molecule and the space it wants to move into. And so in the case of cells, that barrier is our cellular membrane. And so if the membrane is blocking that molecule and not allowing it to spread out into the space that it wants to, instead, water is going to be driven to move. So instead of the molecule being able to spread out into this space that water created, water is going to cross that barrier in order to make space where the molecule is. Right? So it's as if this food coloring dye was outside of the cup. If we dropped it there, the dye would not be able to get into this cup since we have this glass barrier. So instead, water will move out to give that dye space to spread out. Essentially the idea. And so when water is diffusing, that is called osmosis. It's diffusion of water across the membrane. Okay. Essentially, water is going to move in the opposite direction that diffusion is moving. Okay. So in this case here, we have a scenario where there is a high concentration of the solute outside of the cell and a low concentration of the solute inside the cell. And so diffusion is going to want to drive these solutes, the green molecule here, into the cell where there's more space. But in this specific example, this molecule cannot cross the membrane. And so since they cannot spread out to where there's more space, water is going to move towards them, thus making more space for them to spread out. So diffusion drives molecules to go from where there's a lot of them to where there's less of them. Osmosis is going to drive water to move from where there are less of those molecules to where there is more of them, more of the solute. That's kind of what's described there. So water is going to move out of the cell in this example to give more space for these molecules to spread out. And one of the most common examples of the effects of osmosis and where it actually is important or has a large impact on our cells is in our blood. Right? So our red blood cells are actually quite simple compared to the rest of the cells in our body. They're really just designed to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout our bodies. So oxygen to our cells, carbon dioxide back to our lungs. They don't have mitochondria in order to generate a whole bunch of energy. They don't have a nucleus. They're really just there to carry that air throughout our body. And thus are greatly affected by this idea of concentration, can be strongly affected through osmosis. So our red blood cells, when within our blood and have an even concentration of solutes inside and out, they will maintain their shape. I guess let me preface these terms: isotonic, hypotonic, hypertonic, cytolysis, plasmolysis. They're not going to show up again on a quiz or an exam. You'll see these again if you go into other biology courses, but I'm just trying to exemplify where osmosis shows up most often as an impact in our bodies. So when there is an even concentration within and outside of our blood cells, they maintain their shape, they can do their job. But if there is a low concentration outside of the cells, water is going to flood in through osmosis to try to give this high concentration of molecules more space. And as a result, that will eventually cause the cell to burst because the plasma membrane can't hold all that water. And then in the opposite scenario, the opposite is true. So if there's a high concentration of solutes outside of the cell, water will flood out of it, basically making that cell flatten to the point that it cannot function anymore. Right. So last thing here, okay, as we use the ideas from this lecture moving forward in the class, essentially the nutrients that we're getting from our food are often very large molecules. Even through the process of digestion, getting them down to their smallest pieces, those molecules are still going to be quite large in respect to transporting them across a membrane. And so we're going to be looking at the methods that our cells use to move them through our membranes and get them to where we need them. Right? So through eating our food, our goals are to disassemble those large molecules into much, much smaller molecules, as small as we can get them, then absorb those smaller molecules out of our digestive system and into our bloodstream. They will then travel through our bloodstream, through our circulation, throughout the body, and then need to be absorbed into whatever cell is going to use them. And then that cell can use them to build or replace other large molecules in cells in the body. So that's basically it for your cellular biology content before you move into the actual nutrition content. So as always, please reach out with any questions or concerns, and I will see you guys in the next one.